Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, May 17th, 2023. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very happy to be home in Washington, D.C. after 2 weeks on the road, first at the Broadband Communities Conference in Houston, and then at ConnectX in New Orleans of the Wireless Infrastructure Association. We actually last week did two events. One was our typical Broadband Breakfast Live Online, which we pre-recorded and streamed live Wednesday at 12 Eastern. And the second was an in-person event that we hosted at ConnectX. It was on the middle mile, on this topic specifically. Those of you who are members of the Broadband Breakfast Club, our special premium service we offer for $99 a month, will have or do have now access to the video recording of that second event at ConnectX, in addition to our monthly reports, such as the Middle Mile Report, which I'll talk about a little bit later at greater length. You can still read an article, a reporting we did on the event last week on Broadband Breakfast, as with many other articles from those conferences, and of course from Washington and around the country. Broadband Breakfast, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, is a community of people who believe passionately in higher capacity broadband. Better lives is kind of our motto. We cover infrastructure, broadband's impact, and big tech and the impact that they have on the broadband ecosystem. All are welcome to Broadband Breakfast events, including these free events every Wednesday. But we want you to join the Broadband Breakfast Club, not only for these reports we do every month, and next month's report is going to be on the CHIPS and Science Act, okay? Deep dive into the provisions of that law, the access to special videos like the Middle Mile Report at ConnectX, and discounts on special events. And that leads me to our event, the Made in America Summit, that will take place in person at the Samsung Executive Center. Thank you to Samsung, the sponsor of the Made in America Summit. What we're going to be talking about today in this Broadband Breakfast Live Online is a piece of, but not the totality of the issues and topics we'll be addressing at the Made in America Summit. In fact, I encourage you to go to our website and if you could pop it into the URL, so that everyone can see that, or I should say the chat window, so everyone could see the link to the Made in America Summit, or you can just go to broadbandbreakfast.com/MIAS. That will take you to the summit. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to be talking about four panels. One is on scaling up the smart grid and the many interconnections between green infrastructure and telecom and broadband infrastructure, domestic manufacturing and the chips race. That's panel 2. Panel 3 will be on the future of Buy America requirements. So maybe in some respects, kind of a follow-on, deeper dive to what we're talking about today, and creating an American green energy industry. Hope you'll all look at and consider attending. And here's kind of where the Broadband Breakfast Club comes in. We're offering a special discount to attend this in-person summit. The event will be selling at $249 to attend in person, breakfast and lunch included. But if for anyone to sign up between now and June 9th, you can purchase for $199. And we have special rates for nonprofits and broadband providers. But the best rate of all is available for Broadband Breakfast Club members for only $49. So with your $99 subscription and $49, you're very much ahead on purchasing your ticket for the summit. And we hope you will make time to attend. A lot more information will be coming about that as we confirm additional speakers, sponsors, and panelists. I also don't want to neglect to thank our sponsors for Broadband Breakfast Live Online and for our Broadband Breakfast content. We wouldn't be able to do this free programming without the support of our sponsors, including Utopia Fiber, Broadband Money, Comcast, Nokia, Google Fiber, Broadband Now, Lightbox, the Wireless Infrastructure Association, Ookla, the Com Law Group, Michael Baker International, and Positron Access. Thank you to our sponsors. And finally, we're going to talk about Buy America today. case you haven't noticed. There's been a lot happening on this. And again, you can get up to speed by reading what we've written about and others have written about, but what we publish on Broadband Breakfast, there is just at an extremely high level, a lot of focus on this. The Biden administration, President Biden himself have made it very clear there's not going to be a, quote, blanket waiver, although there will be waivers. There are waivers. And for those of you who weren't aware, there was for many months a proposed waiver of Buy America rules for middle mile broadband projects. And that was finally issued on April 19th. It was really issued in May, but they dated it April 19th. And that middle mile waiver largely follows the proposed waiver, although it was kind of curved back just a little bit to require fiber optics to be made in America, where electronics are exempted from the waiver. But more importantly, I think everyone acknowledges is what the Buy America rules are going to do to the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. This is the big enchilada. This is the $42.5 billion program. Numbers for grants to states will be out within 2 months. By June 30th, the National Telecommunications Information Administration will issue those numbers, and there will or won't be, although it's increasingly looking like there will be a waiver, a limited waiver for those who are building BEAD projects. What we're going to be talking about here today is what are some of those problems and concerns and how those are being addressed. So without further ado, I want to mention one more thing. Sorry. For those of you who are interested in this topic, deeply interested in this topic, we would invite you to stay on at the conclusion of our session here today. We start on time, end on time. But if you have the ability and would like to stay, this won't be live streamed. This won't be broadcast. It's just going to be in the Zoom room for those who are still here, or you can still get into the Zoom room. We're gonna ask questions of what you see as the issues that people in our industry are facing, with particular reference to Buy America. So, big windup. Let's introduce our panel, and thank you to all of you for being part of this discussion here. I'm going to introduce our panelists. They are John Windhausen. John has been on our program before. In fact, I think you were one of our first when the pandemic started. Thank you, John. Thank you for everything you do at the school's Health and Libraries Broadband Association. John, in addition to being the executive director of the Shelby Coalition, has spearheaded this really dynamic organization's growth and shapes its broadband policy recommendations. They are the go-to people for community anchor institutions and the policies impacting community anchor institutions in the broadband space. So, John, we're going to look forward to hearing how you've interacted with this issue. Following John, we're going to hear from Patrick Lozada. Patrick is the Director of Global Policy at the Telecommunications Industry Association, and he leads TIA's work on trade, supply chains, and standardization policy. And he was also previously a director in the China practice of the Albrecht Stonebridge Group. So a lot of experience dealing with Asia and China. And then bounding cleanup will be Pam Arluk. Hope I got your pronunciation right there, Pam. We'll call you Pam in the discussion, but Pam's the Vice President and Associate General Counsel of NCTA, which represents the cable and television industry on a number of broadband matters. And in particular, before that, worked at the FCC and the NTIA. We've already discussed on voice and broadband issues. And in particular, at the FCC, she was the chief of the Competition Policy Division there, which of course is responsible for non-pricing policy rules involving wireline voice and broadband services. So Pam, we look forward to getting NCTA's perspective on the broadband infrastructure process through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and with particular reference, of course, to Buy America. So with that, let me turn it over to you, John, to kick off the perspective that you bring to this topic.
Well, thanks very much, Drew. It's a great pleasure to be with you again. I appreciate the multiple invitations to join you for these broadband breakfasts. You've been doing such a great job in elevating the understanding about all of these broadband policies, and Broadband Breakfast is just a wonderful organization. So congrats to you for building it.
Thank you, John.
As Drew said, the Shelby Coalition, we're a public interest group. We are based in Washington, D.C., but we have about 330 members from all across the United States. And our mission is to promote high quality, affordable broadband for anchor institutions and their communities. So we have a very big stake in the success of these broadband programs that were enacted by Congress. And in particular, the BEAD program, we're very much in favor of having that program be successful, in part because the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that Congress passed a year and a half ago, it talks about anchor institutions 29 times in that one piece of legislation. And it further identifies that anchor institutions that have less than gigabit level access, have access to less than gigabit solutions deserve to be brought up to speed and to obtain gigabit access through the BEAD program. So we are very supportive of the BEAD program, as well as the Middle Mile program, the Tribal program, the Connecting Minority Communities program. We think these are wonderful efforts to solve the digital divide and promote broadband deployment and accessibility. So we have a big stake in their success, and that's why we were concerned about these Buy America provisions. You know, I should say at the outset that we are very supportive of the goal of trying to bring these manufacturing capabilities back into this country. We know that President Biden announced the formation of this policy back when he was first inaugurated. Within the first week of taking office, he issued an executive order that calls for greater broadband deployment and created the Future is Made in America by all of America's workers, that initiative within the Office of Management and Budget. And then further, when Congress passed the IIJA, it also adopted the Buy America, Build America provisions, which call for 55% of the costs of broadband network equipment have to be sourced in the United States. So we support those goals. Having said that, we are very concerned that they're not achievable in the short term. That aspiration is easier said than done. While there seems to be enough domestic fiber optic cable to connect communities, the electronic components such as the routers, switches, and semiconductors that transform those glass strands into data highways are made mainly in other countries. And I think you can see this in the Middle Mile waiver request that NTIA published last fall, where NTIA itself recognized that over 70% of the global semiconductor production occurs in Asia, including all of the production of the most advanced chips, and only 12% of production of any kind occurs in the United States. So that's NTIA itself admitting that the United States does not currently have the capability of fulfilling those Made in America requirements that we would all like to see happen. NTIA also recognized that it will take 3 to 5 years for production to be resourced, or for chip manufacturing plants to be built in the United States. So we have a problem because we want to solve the digital divide. We want the BEAD program to be rolled out successfully over the next 4 to 5 years, but strict adherence to the Build America, Buy America provisions are just not feasible at this time. So that's why the Shelby Coalition filed a request for a blanket waiver of the Build America, Buy America provisions back last May 10th of 2022. We filed this letter with Secretary of Commerce Raimondo. I think we were one of the first public interest organizations to raise the visibility and the need for this waiver. Now we understand that the Secretary of Commerce and the White House are not positioned to grant a blanket waiver, but they are doing some good work, which I learned at the TIA Broadband Success Summit a few weeks ago, that they are looking at technology by technology and are expected to grant waivers of particular technologies that they understand and agree are not able to be sourced in the United States. So that sounds like a positive development. Of course, it all depends on what's on that list and what's not on that list. But we have a very strong interest in working with the government to make sure this happens and that list is as inclusive as possible so that these networks can be built to rural communities, to anchor institutions, and to urban communities as well that are lacking access to high-speed broadband. So with that, Drew, I'll turn it back to you and happy to engage in your future questions and answers.
Awesome. Thank you for that wonderful background. Just right, met the Goldilocks test, for amount of content. So Patrick, you obviously, your organization, TIA, has already been referenced. That was an exceptional summit you had on 19th and 20th, I believe. That was focused on BEAD, and you had a number of folks from NTIA, including the head of the Buy America office. Talk a little bit about, within NTIA, talk a little bit about how you and give everyone a quick snapshot for who is TIA so that can be part of the discussion. So floor is yours, Patrick.
Absolutely. Thank you, Drew, and appreciate the kind words about our conference. My name is Patrick Lozada, and I am Director of Global Policy at the Telecommunications Industry Association, a trade association representing the manufacturers and suppliers of telecommunications equipment and services. TIA members come from across the broadband ecosystem and include manufacturers of fiber optic cable, radio access network manufacturers, manufacturers of switchers and routers, satellite internet devices, handsets, and other equipment. And our members really build the equipment that is going to make the IIJA's investment in broadband a reality. And as you might expect, we're strong proponents of the legislation. We think it's so vital that we work to connect every American to high-speed broadband internet. So as you might expect, given that we represent the equipment manufacturers, Buy America has been a really central issue for us when we're looking at IIJA implementation. And that's why in January of last year, we led a coalition of associations in really highlighting this for the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Agriculture, and other departments that have responsibility for broadband in the federal government, outlining why we think there's a critical case for a waiver. Because, as has already been said, there's no combination of products that connects folks to the internet and meets Buy America requirements. And so, similar to what John said, we really support U.S. manufacturing, and I want to state that up top. We're aligned with the administration's goals here, particularly his call to say use U.S.-made fiber optic cables to build relevant federally funded U.S. networks. That said, fiber optic cable alone will not build a network, and there's lots of technologies that folks will need to use to connect every American to the internet. We did a survey of our members back in late 2021, early 2022, and we found that there was no combination of products that would connect folks to the internet, as I said previously, and would meet Buy America requirements, and that the largest shortcoming was in the supply of US-made semiconductors. And so, this is a major problem for the implementation of this legislation. And it fundamentally means that without a waiver from the Commerce Department and OMB, this program can't get off the ground in the short to medium term. I just want to highlight a couple of other potential impacts of this program just to maybe think of and keep in mind, because there is this kind of threshold question, right? Can we put anything in the ground? Can we build internet in the field if we don't get a waiver? But what the dimensions and what the specifics are really important. So, there could be other impacts as well past that threshold challenge, looking at things like, less deployment through increased costs. We could see fewer high-paying jobs. Broadband deployment jobs pay really well, an average of more than $36 an hour. If we're shifting the spend towards manufacturing, maybe we're decreasing good-paying jobs for workers. We could face an uneven build-out because the legislation and NTIA guidance actually creates sort of a two-tier system where there are actually 37 states that, because they have prior existing international trade commitments, have broader access to products from partner countries via a waiver process there, and then 13 other states, Alaska, Arkansas, Georgia, Indiana, Ohio, South Carolina, they don't have that same level of grounds to call for waivers. And so how do we make sure that we're really building everywhere and making sure that everyone gets connected to the internet? And lastly, could this lead to some sort of technology preference? The IIJ was pretty clear, and the intent of Congress was to create a program that was technology neutral. But let's say we waive certain products and don't waive other products. That could limit different types of technologies from being able to deploy in the field successfully. So, this sounds dire, but, at the end of the day, we're optimistic. We think there's a way to thread the needle here and chart a path towards a waiver that supports deployment and U.S. manufacturing in the ICT industry by a targeted time-limited waiver.
Well, thank you very much for laying out those perspectives. A lot of good stuff there. We'll come back to that very much in the discussion. Let's turn now to Pam. Look forward to hearing some of the issues on NCTA's mind as you consider the Buy America requirements.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I first want to say that I absolutely agree with everything that both John and Patrick said. We have been working with the administration as well. We've been meeting with NTIA. This is an issue. My member companies, just to back up a little bit, NCTA represents both small and large cable companies, and pretty much all of them are interested in the BEAD program. It's a very exciting program, and everyone is very interested in the goals of the program to get broadband out to everyone, and are very supportive of the idea of Buying America. However, there is a lot of concern among the industry that even with the fiber optics, the larger cable companies are less concerned about the supply available for BEAD. But I will say even they and the smaller cable companies are concerned that when the demand, when the BEAD program really gets going and there's a lot of demand for fiber, that there may not be sufficient supply from domestic fiber suppliers to be able to meet all of the supply for BEAD. And then everything that Patrick and John said about the electronics not being available in domestically is absolutely true, and that has been a big concern. Now that being said, we are optimistic that the administration is going to grant a waiver. We were quite relieved to see the middle mile waiver, because even though it isn't precedential, a lot of the equipment is going to be the same. So that equipment is not going to magically materialize in domestically for BEAD. So, we thought that was, a very good sign. So that was very good news. And I do want to say, it's interesting. So I just started at NCTA in January, and for the 20 years previously, I was at the commission at the FCC, and I'm very used to companies coming in and telling me that this is something that can't be done, that something that the commission wanted was something that couldn't be done. And, you can usually tell when the issue is like it's a matter of it being expensive, or it's a matter of something that really can't be done. And here, when everyone is really saying the same thing, this really is something that is just not able to be accomplished. The Buy America requirements, because the equipment just doesn't exist in the US. And if you look at the comments that were filed in March with OMB, they're all consistent across every industry.
Thank you. Thank you for this this perspective and these thoughts here, Pam. There's so many things we can dive into, and let's just start with maybe backing up in the history of Buy America, right? I mean, do any of the three of you feel like you could speak to like what it was before 2021, when the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act kind of reinstantiated it by including specific provisions for Buy America in the IIJA. You see you raising your hand there, Patrick. Go ahead.
Yeah, happy to do that. So the Buy America, it's so funny. There's Buy America, Buy American, and then there's Build America, Buy America. So there are all these terms, but they go back to legislation passed originally in the 1930s, 1933, the Buy American Act, signed by President Hoover, to require federal purchases of certain types of equipment from US sources. That's gone through a number of instantiations over the year, but one that I think is really important is that when the federal government buys its own products, let's say I'm a federal agency, they have to meet Buy America requirements, and they've had to for a very long time. They have something called the IT Waiver, the commercial off-the-shelf IT Waiver. And so for themselves, they waive those requirements. Not same for rural America, but it's different equipment, right? It's the broad range of IT equipment, the requirements for which are waived. When it comes to broadband, we've also had some specific cases of application, specifically in the 2009 America Reinvestment and Recovery Act. And around those programs, there was a Buy America requirement in that program that was actually worded identically to the one that was in the IIJA. Now, one thing that's interesting here is at the time, the Department of Commerce and the Rural Agriculture Service took a look at this and found that a waiver was in the public interest because there were no sources for the equipment, one, and that the process of needing to certify that the equipment met the standards in the IIJA would just be impossible for grantees to meet. And therefore, it was in the public interest to waive 6 categories of products. And that allowed the program to go forward while maintaining a Buy America requirement for certain segments of the supply chain, such as fiber optic cable, things like steel that goes into towers. And that allowed the program to really go forward there. So this is kind of the latest iteration of that in IIJA.
I really appreciate that history. Do you happen to know those 6 topics off the spur of your head?
I have them in a one-pager here somewhere. If you give me a second, I can give them. But they're pretty broad. They're things like routing equipment, right? They're things like access equipment. So it's at a very high level and doesn't drill down to specific product categories in the way that, for example, the middle mile waiver did.
Okay, we'd love to get a copy of that and post it on the page. You all should know that immediately after this live stream ends, and right now it's live on the page for this event. So you can do that for all previous Broadband Breakfast Live Online if ever you want to find one. So Patrick, you identified the BTOP, the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program of 2009, kind of, you're saying the language in that legislation, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, was identical to IIJA, and yet we're seeing a kind of a different process. I don't know kind of why the Obama administration and the Biden administration are taking different courses, but Biden made a very high profile mention of Buy America in his State of the Union address, specifically on fiber optic cables, which got a lot of people's attention because they were like, whoa, wait a second, what does this mean? Because as you pointed out, there is no way, quote unquote, to do this with everything, particularly with those semiconductor components. But let's talk through some of the specific details. John, if you've looked at these, Pam, you've thoughts, and Patrick, if you want to kind of come back to what is and isn't feasible from the perspective of purchasing from American manufacturers.
Well, Drew, I don't have as detailed knowledge as Patrick does, but I do have a couple of quotes that I think are relevant from the BTOP days that Patrick mentioned. So in 2009, the Secretary of Commerce determined that as applied to certain broadband equipment used in the BTOP program, that application of the Buy America provision would be inconsistent with the public interest. That was the official finding. And then Secretary of Commerce went further to say it would be difficult, if not impossible, for a BTOP applicant to have certain knowledge of the manufacturing origins of each component of a broadband network. And a requirement to do so would be so overwhelmingly burdensome as to deter participation in the program. So I think that concept applies equally well, if not more so today. The BTOP program was largely a middle mile investment program. Now with BEAD, we're talking primarily about a last mile broadband investment program. So we're trying to build broadband to those areas that are the highest cost, that are the hardest to reach. And if anything, we want to be encouraging more organizations to apply for these BEAD funds. But a strict adherence to the Buy America provisions would discourage organizations from applying for that funding. And so that would really send the wrong message to both the industry and, it's not just the industry. The Shelby Coalition also has several research and education networks that are members of our organization, and they've been doing a great job of building out broadband to the anchor institutions and are trying to expand their networks to serve more rural markets. And they are prime beneficiaries or prime potential applicants for this BEAD funding. But as I said, a strict adherence to the Buy America provisions are going to make that not feasible for a lot of organizations to apply for that funding. And it's kind of counterproductive to the whole goal that the BEAD program is trying to address.
Yeah,
Ken,
and notably in the middle mile waiver, the only equipment that was removed from the proposed waiver is the fiber.
So
was the fiber.
Just unpack that a little bit, Pam. So like your members, when they're considering applying for BEAD or other funding, what are the specific areas of concern that they cannot get to that 55% made in America line?
I mean, I would say, all of the electronics that are needed to light the fiber. I mean, I'm not an equipment expert to the extent that Patrick is, but all of the electronics that are needed with the fiber, but even the fiber, I mean, when I've talked to some of the members, I think there is some concern, although I don't think it sounds like it doesn't sound like the administration's planning to move off of their stance on fiber, but I think there is some concern that there's not going to be sufficient supply once there's like full demand of BEAD, but but there is domestic supply of fiber. I mean, that is true.
Right. Well, I mean, the difference, and I really appreciate you setting the historical context, Patrick. The difference is that there's been so much of a focus in the 3 or 4 years preceding the passage of IIJA on supply chain, on kind of, I mean, sometimes that's just a euphemism for not having Chinese gear, right? But it is broader than that. It's about like, where is the equipment coming from, and how do we make sure that it's not going to be a national security threat? And then you add on top of that the true supply chain disruptions that COVID brought, which led to kind of macro challenges in the economy, right? And so this is a focus, and everyone in the world knows that there's supply chain issues, right? And so now that we're cognizant of the supply chain issues, well, what's happened with manufacturing of fiber? Was it always there? Is it ramped up? What's happening on electronic equipment? Is it ramping up? Are there other issues besides those two? Again, let's turn to you, Patrick, to kick off this phase here.
Yeah, sure. Happy to share my perspective. Well, there's definitely been a growing investment in the fiber optic cabling supply chains, and that's been really exciting. Our CEO was very happy to go down to North Carolina and participate in a series of events with Secretary Raimondo and Governor Cooper at plants for Corning and CommScope, 2 TIA members who are building new facilities there to really build more capacity in this really critical part of the connectivity supply chain. So there are investments that are going on, and there are folks who do build parts of the ICT supply chain in the United States. Now, the thing is that the requirements under the IIJA are different right? They're high. They require for some products that all activity related to manufacturing, for example, for fiber optic cable, which is classified as a construction material, occur inside the United States. And then for what they call manufactured products, it has to meet a 55% and a domestic substantial transformation threshold, which excludes even stuff that for which some part of the manufacturing process occurs in the United States. If you don't get up to that 55%, it's a really, really high bar for a lot of these products, which are sourced from inputs that come from all over the world. It's fundamentally a global industry. And so that's one thing that we have to think about, I think, as we propose solutions to this. What are ways that we can rely on America's strengths, work with our allies and partners to source the products that we need? Is trade with Mexico, for example, going to blow up overnight because of concerns about an invasion of Taiwan? Or is trade with Canada or Europe, right? Can we use those because they're part of what are called Trade Agreements Act countries, not Europe, but the other two, for the purposes of sourcing equipment and still build a robust multi-source supply chain that we can count on for the future?
Do you see love other perspectives and thoughts, but I want to ask a follow-up, Patrick, again, given your deep kind of digging into this, do the Buy America rules account for the distinction between kind of democratic countries or countries that are more allied with the United States and those that may not be?
So they don't in those terms. What I will say, and this is a really important part of the IIJA and then subsequent guidance, OMB 2211 and NTIA's waivers on this front, it's the fact that all procurement has to comply with global trading rules. And it says that clearly in the legislation, the subsequent guidance. What does that mean? Well, it means that, at least the way we see it, countries like a lot of our allies and partners who have signed on to something called the Government Procurement Agreement should by law face then no restrictions or should be treated equally if sourcing products from those partners. And that's an international agreement that Congress ratified, we agreed to, they agreed to, and then subsequently those 37 states that I mentioned to subsequently agreed to. And so, if we double down on that, and those are agreements with our partners and allies, we're still promoting a robust supply chain, located in places that share our values.
Well, and that's a great point that kind of has come to my attention recently. What does it mean for a state to have a free trade agreement? I mean, this is kind of an interesting little puzzler of constitutional law, right? I mean, clearly the federal government's preeminent, particularly on trade matters, but states actually do have agreements with foreign nations, right? Talk a little bit about what this means, what these 37 states are doing.
Yeah, and this is something that went back to when the U.S. Trade Representative's Office was negotiating the Government Procurement Agreement, as well as other free trade agreements. And it was a process by which, through USTR, engaging with, obviously the federal government having the preeminent position here to engage in international relations and international trade deals, signed up in parallel to comply with the Government Procurement Agreement and assume the obligations therein. And by the way, the Government Procurement Agreement also benefits products that we manufacture in the US. It makes sure that when we produce things here, other governments are required to treat them with the same status as they're treating products manufactured in their country. So it's very much in the American interest and in the interest of the telecommunications industry.
Pam or John, do you want to add anything to this point, these points we've been talking about?
Well, Drew, I don't have a specific response to Patrick's wealth of information about the history. I do feel obliged to make one comment, which is it's important not to be too one-dimensional about this in our conversation. I mean, the United States does have a problem that we are not manufacturing these electronics in the United States. And I note that the Department of Defense has recognized that the United States is the world's leader in technology innovation, but most hardware manufacturing takes place in other countries. And further, the Department of Defense says that the dependence on foreign sources for semiconductor product represents a serious threat to economic prosperity and national security of the United States. I think we've just seen this too with the rip and replace program, trying to eliminate the Chinese-made equipment from our networks. So I don't want to minimize the problem or the need for a solution. But I think it's important to recognize that we need to achieve this goal of domestic source manufacturing over time. In the last few years, like the last 10 years, the United States, according to ITIF, which issued a really great report on this topic a little over a year ago, the United States manufacturing capability for electronics declined from 29% to 25%. But meanwhile, the Chinese output of these same circuits grew astoundingly from 4% up to now 29%. So the Chinese investments in these technologies is a serious threat to our national security and our economic security. So I do appreciate where the Biden administration is coming from in trying to encourage more domestic manufacturing. But trying to do so on a flash cut basis or just in a couple of years is just not in the cards, and it's going to delay this broadband build out. But further, the Made in America working group, or whatever it's called in OMB, is not talking about increasing the domestic content from 55% up to 75% in the next couple of years. So these are very ambitious and goals, and probably unachievable goals. So we need to give ourselves greater time and look at the broad category of different ways of encouraging greater investment in U.S. manufacturing capabilities, like the CHIPS and Science Act that Congress just passed. That is a very worthwhile effort to spawn greater manufacturing in this country. And that's, I think, perhaps a better and more targeted way to increase our domestic production capabilities than imposing a Build America, Buy America requirement on the build out of these new broadband networks in the short run.
Well, and that's just, again, a perfect thing to highlight. Our Made in America Summit, I guess got to hold it just right. This is one of the topics that we'll be addressing, right? The Science and Chips Act, right? Or the Chips Act and Science Act, because the numbers are indeed, startling and perhaps even scary. China's gone from 4% to 29%. We've gone down to 25, I think was the number. So these are important strategic issues. But again, can we make the perfect the enemy of the good? I mean, what I'd also like to get your perspective on is, think of all of the American jobs that are going to be fostered by the deployment of these networks, none of which can be outsourced because they are literally building infrastructure in the ground or on towers in the United States. So I'd love to, and this was mentioned, I think, by someone a little bit earlier, but does anyone want to speak to the kind of the relative jobs factor? And a reminder to please give us your questions. We still have another 15 minutes. If you'd like to put them in Zoom, we can get them. We're also on multiple other platforms and we can see your questions there. So I'm going to turn to Pam unless we get some more questions here about the jobs aspect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I was just thinking that when John was talking that, I absolutely agree with everything John said, that, I think we should try to encourage, more manufacturing in the U.S., but the estimates are that it would take at least, at a minimum, 3 to 5 years to bring a semiconductor chip plant to the U.S. And even though the BEAD program is going to be over several years, I mean, that's still just not enough time. And in the meantime, we're talking, thousands of jobs in the U.S. to build in these BEAD programs. So I feel like they're kind of, the administration sort of cutting off their nose to spite their face, that it's, it just seems like not really an efficient use of resources to try to use the BEAD program in this manner.
Well, I will say in recent events, including yours, TIA, but also at Broadband Communities and at the ConnectX, officials from NTIA spoke to this, and they do speak about the kind of the tension between, hey, let's get an infrastructure deployment and reshoring or enhancing American manufacturing. We're seeing the same battle in other fronts, like, for example, green energy, right? There's a tension between the infrastructure deployment for long transmission lines and the potential permitting issues we've all talked about, John and others, right? The permitting process is not easy for broadband. Well, it certainly isn't easy for some of the electric front either. And these, again, will all be discussed at our Made in America Summit. Again, I want to invite your further discussions, but I'd love to hear from you, Patrick, on what you're hearing about the way a BEAD waiver might be different from the middle mile waiver that's already been issued.
Sure. And, I've heard a lot of the same things that have already been shared. It's something that they are working on, and that it's going to be different than what the middle mile waiver looked like. Per OMB rules, it has to be time limited, but because the granting process will take out over a longer period of time, that's going to have different ongoing compliance requirements. I think that because it's addressing that last mile, that's going to be something that is going to require a different approach. The products that you're talking about there have different requirements and honestly contain a lot more electronics. I think it was the DHS stating industry data said that 90% of all radio components are made in Asia, not in America, in Asia. So, the way we have to go on this long way to 55% for a lot of these products. And, that includes semiconductors, and that's the big element of it, but it also includes a lot of other components. So it's going to take time, but, we do support the idea to bring more manufacturing here. And we think it comes through stronger carrots, like in the CHIPS Act.
Mm-hmm. Pam, John, do you want to add anything on maybe the middle mile process? When Shelby filed your waiver request, it was specifically focused on the middle mile, John, is that correct? Because that's really the area you're more involved in.
Well, actually, no, we asked for a waiver for the entire BEAD program, which covers, last mile and middle mile, but we were using the experience that we gained from waiving the rules during the BTOP program. That program was focused on middle mile, but now it's both a last mile and a middle mile problem. And so we're really concerned about network deployment. I would just add too that you mentioned that NTIA and Commerce did grant a waiver of the Buy America provisions for the middle mile program, but also my understanding is they also waived the Build America provisions for the tribal broadband program and for the Connecting Minority Communities program, two other broadband funding programs at NTIA. So those are also good precedents that we hope that the Secretary of Commerce draws upon as they consider what kind of waivers to grant for the BEAD program.
Pam, you have any thoughts on the middle mile versus last mile question?
Yeah, so we have been actively talking with NTIA about what additional equipment with our companies would be required for the last mile piece of the BEAD waiver, and we found NTIA to be, the staff over there is really great. So we've been, talking with them, and I know that they're actively talking to the industries, various industries. I know they're actively talking to vendors. So I know that's something they're working on and hoping to get out, I think within the next few months.
Yeah. We heard, Patrick, from your colleague, Melissa Newman, last week when we were at ConnectX. We unveiled our report on the middle mile. There's a little section in here on the Build America, Buy America rules, but this report goes into the middle mile program generally and how it's going to roll out with the use of, I guess how it will impact, how the last mile program will be impacted or will come back to affect this program. We're all, of course, waiting very patiently for the middle mile awards. It was stated they would be announced no sooner than March 1st. Now we're hearing they'll be announced sometime in the spring, which means by June 21st, the last day of spring. And of course, we are all expecting an announcement of the amounts that states will be receiving for BEAD by June 30th. And what I've been hearing when at these events I've been at is that there is now kind of a more definitive tone from the NCTA that there will be a waiver of BEAD. It's just before maybe even 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago at your event, Patrick, it wasn't as definitive. So I don't know whether that's a good sign or not a good sign, an unclear sign. We're going to go ahead and if there's any questions from our audience, please feel free to ask them on either Zoom or the other platforms. Otherwise, let's go ahead and give each of our panelists a chance to offer some closing remarks on this issue of the Buy America provisions, how the administration should be tackling it, and what broadband providers at the middle mile and last mile should be looking towards in navigating this. And let's just go in the same order we've gone in, John and Patrick and Pam.
Thanks, Drew. I guess I would just say in closing, I do want to applaud the Biden administration for the depth of their analysis. When you look at the waiver that was granted for so far, it's very detailed, going into very explicit mentions of different kinds of networking equipment and optical equipment. So I do appreciate the the rigorous analysis that they're bringing to the situation. And I think they're very aware of the conflicting trends of wanting to source in the United States, but also wanting to solve the digital divide. And so I think they are working this through. I guess I'm somewhat optimistic as well, because if you look at the timeline of the BEAD program funding, about 20% of those funds will be released in 2024, and the remaining 80% probably not until 2025. So even though that's a longer time frame than I would like to see, it does give NTIA some time to come out with some guidance, which we hope comes this year, on what BEAD program waiver is going to look like, technology by technology. And if they can get that out the door in 2023, then that sets up, that provides the guidance to the potential applicants for BEAD funding, that they know what's on the table and what they can do, and they can plan their networks accordingly. And I think having that information in advance of actually getting the funding and deploying the networks is really going to be critical to having these projects work successfully.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Patrick.
Yeah, I'm a bit biased here, but I think this is, one of the most important issues, the most important issue in my mind, to get right in terms of rolling out broadband to unserved Americans. And that just is going to make a difference in so many people's lives. My family comes from rural America. My dad owned a junkyard outside of Walterboro, South Carolina. And it was just this last year where we got fiber internet to our house. And that was enormously helpful in terms of supporting my mom's ability to run her business and stay connected with the world during COVID-19. So incredibly important to get this right. And I really, overall, really want to congratulate the folks at NTIA and across the administration for approaching this with a degree of nuance and being willing to engage throughout the process. And just making sure that we get the specifics right. There are a lot of very specific details. What is a construction material? What is a de minimis amount of US content? What are our trade obligations and how do they, compare to other states? These details are really important to nail down and then provide certainty to a range of grantees across the country. And so being able to communicate the requirements really clearly is also going to be important. And I think but I am at the end of the day optimistic that we will get it right because we have to.
I'm going to just interrupt you, Pam, because we've gotten a great question in, and we're still a few minutes out. Dan Grossman asked this question. Most of the value in the electronics is not in manufacturing, but rather in intellectual property. software, chips designs, mask works, patents. Why has this not been taken into account in these conversations? This is a great question, right? How could intellectual property, these designs, be included in the value imputation of a Buy America product? Let me ask you that, Patrick.
Sure. So it's our view that it should, right? And that is both valuing U.S. jobs and innovation and will help us get to an adequate deployment threshold. I'll say that in past application, there has not been a clear way to do it in previous legal frameworks. For example, under the Buy America Act, it was, I believe, not particularly clear that you were able to include intellectual property in US content. But I think it's certainly something that we would support. And we think that the Commerce Department should try to approach it this way and engaging with OMB to create appropriate rules.
Any other questions on that, John? And if not, we'll give Pam the last word to reply and to offer some concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I will say that is something that I saw raised in the OMB comments as well. That's an issue that a lot of parties raised. So I think that's definitely something that should be looked at, and to see if there's a way to help get to that, if that could help us get to the 55%, the intellectual property, that would be great. And I just want to say that I'm also optimistic. I think the staff at NTIA is really great. They're really digging in. They're really engaging with the industry. And we're happy to work with them. Everyone, I think, wants this program to be successful. So I think that's really the best thing, that everyone is coming from that place where we all want this program to be really successful. So we're hoping, we're very optimistic that we're going to be able to get a waiver that's going to make this work for everyone.
Well, wonderful. That will have to be our last word. As I said earlier, if you'd like to stay on and discuss the upcoming plans for the Made in America Summit, feel free to stay on the Zoom link, only through Zoom. And with that, on behalf of our three great panelists, which we have heard from here and heard in other events, Patrick Lozado of TIA, John Winhausen of Shelby, and Pam Arlook of NCTA. I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care, everybody.